Welcome to Life and Liberty Radio with David Householder. I'm Josh Jose, and together, you and I are taking another step toward freedom, both spiritual and political. So get comfortable, breathe in, and ignite your imagination. Envision a society that is spiritually deep and truly free. It's easy if you try.
Well, welcome back. This is part 2 of 2 in my podcast, Send for God. And I would invite you, if you haven't heard it, to go back and listen to Send for God. Number 1, this is Send for God. Number 2 of 2. We have a challenge. We have a problem because we've had an axiomatic shift in our nation. And if we can't agree on axioms, we can't agree on anything. Now, you might say, well, it's okay. It's a free country. We can disagree on axioms. Well, you really can't. You can't have a football game unless you can agree on where to chalk the lines and what the rules are going to be. And then you can have a contest. And then you can have all kinds of freedom to disagree about everything. And that's the way the Founding Fathers set things up. So we talked about Euclid and we talked about Jefferson. And we talked about how there is an incompatible disagreement in this country right now between two separate ways of thinking. Way number 1 is Jefferson's postulate, Jefferson's axiom, that the higher power, the creator, is the source of all of our other axioms, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And view number 2 is that a higher power is an inappropriate idea in public discourse. Now, there's no way that these two ways of chalking the field are appropriate. It's like having a football field and a baseball diamond chalked at the same time and two different games going on. We cannot have a society that way. We don't have to agree on everything, but we have to agree on the basic rules of engagement before we get started. Let me give you a real practical illustration. As a pastor, I spend a lot of time in recovery groups. We have a lot of church members in recovery. We call them 12-step groups. They're all based on the Alcoholics Anonymous model, and I like doing 5th steps with people. It's something I really enjoy doing. And in a 12-step group, the thing that holds it together is the idea of a higher power. You see, there's a problem of diversity. Diversity was a problem in the early days of this nation, and it's a problem now. It's a great blessing. Diversity is a blessing, and diversity is a problem. It's both. It's two sides of the same coin. If we look at diversity, one of the blessings is we get lots of points of view. This is why we have families where we have different points of view within the family, and we have to kind of work it out together. And it's a good thing. It's a good thing to be on a team. You've noticed if you've been on a team at work, it's much smarter than an individual. A team or a board or a club or a committee is always a good way to do things because one person never sees the whole picture. So it's a great advantage to have diversity. The problem with diversity is that we sometimes don't have agreement about what game we're playing as to how we interact with each other, how we make things work. And in a 12-step group, there's certain axioms, certain things which are non-debatable that have to be non-debatable. You have to agree on the rules before you play Monopoly. You have to agree on the rules before you play chess. There's different rules with Monopoly. There's house rules, like you put the money in the middle if you pay fines, and if you land on a certain thing, then you get them all. That's a house rule. You have to agree on that. You can't have some people playing with that rule and some people not. So people can disagree about everything. But that disagreement only works if we're playing the same game together. And they solve the problem of diversity because people come to 12-step groups with all kinds of worldviews, secular worldviews, Christian worldviews, worldviews from all kinds of different religions or no religion or New Age stuff or whatever. They come to 12-step groups with lots of worldviews. But if they're going to do big work together, they have to agree on some basic ideas. And the way they solve it is through saying, all right, we have different opinions about what's behind all this. Let's just call it a higher power. Well, the truth is that works, and you can systematically and empirically show that 12-step groups that emphasize the higher power do a much better job of recovery than those who don't. And it's the same thing with our country. Our country had a problem of diversity, and that problem of diversity was solved by having the solution being a generic Judeo-Christian higher power, the Almighty, the Creator, Providence. Those were the three favorite words of our founding fathers and our presidents throughout history. So the rule was that you had to invoke a higher power for the republic to work, because all of our rights derive from our Creator. As Jefferson said, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. So we have to appeal to that Creator for the game to work. And along came the 60s, and people decided we're going to change the game. We're no longer going to appeal to a higher power. In fact, we're going to punish people who do that in public and tell them they can't and take them to court. And we are going to replace the higher power with a secular, non-God-oriented, non-creator-oriented worldview. Well, the truth is, in our country, they never tried to turn the country into a church, and they weren't trying to Christianize the country per se, although I'm sure there's some leaders that were trying to do just that. The goal of Jefferson and Franklin and others was to make sure that we were grounded in spiritual principles. Because if we're grounded in spiritual principles, then our rights and our chalking of the field will be beyond question so that we can argue about everything else. And they believed that if we left the decisions about our basic axioms up to votes, then the people could give us rights and the people could vote them away. And in times of stress, that's exactly what people do. People value security over basic natural rights. And that's just not a good thing, because then any government can sort of manufacture a crisis. And in manufacturing the crisis, they can say, hey, we need to take away the rights for a little while because this is martial law. This is a time we have to clamp down because you're not safe. And it's pretty easy for government to make people feel unsafe and thereby creating a need for control. And we've been at war now for 2 presidencies. And it looks like we're going into permanent war, and it's exactly the way they want it. And the reason they want it that way, I'm being cynical, probably too cynical, and I'm probably overstating that. But it's to their advantage to want that, because if we feel insecure, if we feel there's danger, then they can take away our rights and put through the Patriot Act and spy on us and read our emails and everything else because it's for national security. This is exactly what the Founding Fathers didn't want to happen. So as goes the 12-step group, so goes the nation. We need to appeal to some higher power for the thing to function right. And if you take the higher power out of a 12-step group, it tends not to work. If you take the higher power, the Creator, Providence, the Almighty, if you take that out of the government equation, the government stops working, because then the government is arbitrary. It depends on what people vote. And then the majority tends to take away the rights of minorities. And if you have 2 Peters and 1 Paul, then the 2 Peters will always vote to take away Paul's money. And so we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. And that was the whole idea of the axiomatic postulating of a higher power in the center of everything, no matter what. And Lincoln very much bought into that, as did Jefferson. Jefferson got most of his thinking from Thomas Aquinas and John Locke. Aquinas was the person who most put together, the great theologian, Roman Catholic theologian, who put together the idea of natural law. That law is natural. It's not arbitrary, just something we vote on. Murder is just wrong, not because a majority of people think it is, because I've been to a place in Ethiopia where there's 1.3 million people in a certain part of Ethiopia who do not believe that murder is wrong. And it's a real mess. It's a real mess there. It's part of their culture to kill someone before you get married. And it just sends chills up the spine of most people, not just because it's a different culture, it's just wrong. And natural human rights belong to everyone. And that was Aquinas' idea. And John Locke believed in social contract, that we would come together and make decisions together. It's the basis of democracy as we know it. But Locke believed that democracy and social contract never works if you let atheism into the system. You can let atheists into the system, but atheism or secularism or a non-God-oriented society will by nature become arbitrary. If it becomes arbitrary, then we're in trouble. So we have to avoid it's like a bowling alley. And that bowling alley is on one hand, in one gutter, there is dogma, that we're just going to make a religious state, a theocracy, that we're going to impose religion on people. And the other gutter ball is that we're going to completely sanitize our society of anything spiritual and any spiritual or created grounding. And what we have to do is we have to keep the ball on the wood. We have to keep the bowling ball on the wood between those two gutter balls. And right now we're throwing a gutter ball into the gutter of secularization. And we're saying it's basically inappropriate to talk about a higher power, even though all of our rights derive from that higher power. So Lincoln, Jefferson, Locke, and Aquinas, postulates and axioms. This is the cornerstone of our republic. The cornerstone is the phrase in the Declaration of Independence that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that we are created equal. We're not equal because we got voted that way or we decided to be that way. We have equal and infinite value as human beings. And so that being said, it's taken us a couple centuries to live into that axiom, and that axiom has held, and we're starting to lose our grip on it right now. And so the axiom was the Declaration, or those phrases in the Declaration that grounded us in a God-centered, creator-centered order. And the theorems that come out of that, if you're going to use geometry language, are the Bill of Rights. And so the Bill of Rights depend on that sense of created order. And I'm going to read to you a couple of really important documents from our past, and they're going to be chilling as to how far we've come since the early 60s. And I'm going to start with the New York prayer, which was the prayer that got prayer banned from the public schools. And prayer in the public schools is a great thing, and as long as it's generic. It can't be Muslim. It can't be evangelical Christian. It can't be Baptist. It can't be Catholic. It can't be Jewish. It has to be generic, higher power stuff. And that's the way the prayers were. That was the rule back then, and it worked. That was the solution for the diversity we had, was having a generic higher power, just like a 12-step group. And instead, now the solution is secularization. Let's not talk about anything spiritual. And we've despiritualized and decoupled the foundation of our republic from the actual founding thinking itself, where we've lost track of our own DNA. Well, here's the prayer that was so offensive that it went to the Supreme Court. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. Amen. This was the prayer that was prayed in New York, and it was the Board of Regents of the New York public education system gave that to the teachers to use. And this was, once again, not a way of making everyone a Christian or anything like that. It was a way of grounding our republic in a higher order. And it was very useful. And I just can't imagine that anybody would think that praying that prayer would be harmful to our society. But let me take this a step farther. I want to read from you the conclusion to the greatest speech ever made in the United States. And no, it wasn't one of Obama's speeches. And no, it wasn't one of Kennedy's speeches, although his were really, really good, probably the best in my lifetime. And it was one of Abraham Lincoln's. And it was not the Gettysburg Address. It was the second inaugural address. And I would like to read from the conclusion of this, which is one of the greatest theological pieces ever written. And Abraham Lincoln struggled with his faith, and arguably he became a Christian at the end of his life. He was a committed atheist as a young man, and his process of going from atheist to Christian was quite a process. And through that, he had to find meaning in what was happening. And he found great power in the grounding of our republic upon the sense of providence or a higher power. Listen to the conclusion of this remarkable speech. Both sides, that's the North and the South, read the same Bible, and they pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. In other words, coercion. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty, note the generic sense of God's presence. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, But woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. In other words, punishment to the United States for having slavery in the first place. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsmen or the slaves, 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow, his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. A little emotional reading that there, and I think a person should get emotional reading that. And as Lincoln would say, a house divided cannot stand. We must agree on our axioms. And to agree on anything but a generic sense of a powerful almighty creator is to deny our very DNA as a nation. Thus, when you look at the next coin or dollar bill that says, "In God we trust," remember that our entire republic depends upon retrieving and grounding ourselves in that very idea.
So put some sunshine and water on these fresh ideas and keep taking that next step toward freedom. Join us every weekday for the latest life and liberty ideas. The views expressed on this program are purely those of the presenter, and not necessarily those of the advertisers or organizations or persons with which the presenter has a relationship. Please click on the Amazon banner at the top of the Life and Liberty page, and consider doing all your online shopping through this portal. See you tomorrow.